Hi, I'm Walt Grayson. I'm in the military park at Vicksburg to invite you to stay with me for the next hour as we commemorate the 150th anniversary of the siege of Vicksburg. We'll go through some of the most scenic territory in the state of Mississippi, following Grant's route as he came in from Bruinsburg, Mississippi, up through Raymond, Jackson, and then to Vicksburg. We'll also talk to some people who have some observations and maybe even a little small stake in this battle, even 150 years later. And I think you'll find it very informative, and I think we're going to have a good time. This is modern-day Vicksburg, Mississippi. Today, the city of Vicksburg is a busy port city on the Mississippi River. In it, you'll find pretty much everything you need. Adequate medical care, plenty of restaurants, shopping at a carefully revived downtown, and even a discount mall. Churches of every denomination, and casinos to counterbalance the churches. And history. Boy, does Vicksburg have the history. From the time of the Native Americans and their mounds, like this mound in the National Cemetery, to the French in the 1700s at Fort St. Peter at Redwood on the Yazoo River just north of present-day Vicksburg. And then the Spanish who built their Fort Nogales at Fort Hill in the present-day National Military Park. Nogales means walnut trees in Spanish, by the way, and then when the English took over the area, they renamed it Walnut Hills. Then later, the Americans got it and renamed it Vicksburg, after an early pioneer Methodist minister here knew it Vic. It's a place where Coca-Cola was first put into bottles for distribution. Up till then, it was just a fountain drink. And its strategic location on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, south of Memphis, made it a target in the Civil War. And towns sprang up everywhere the bluffs in southwest Mississippi touched the river. Vicksburg, Grand Gulf, Rodney, Natchez, Fort Adams. But Vicksburg not only commanded a view of the river from the impregnable bluffs, but the East-West Railroad also ran through Vicksburg. And that's why, when the nation turned in on itself in the Civil War, that President Lincoln of the North almost immediately eyed Vicksburg and uttered what became a challenge when he declared, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." And to Union General U.S. Grant, who had never really been all that much of a success at anything else, Vicksburg became his goal, his obsession, and ultimately his ticket to the White House. But that was a long way down the road, a road that's rather hazy as to exactly know where to mark its beginning, that road to Ulysses S. Grant's victory at Vicksburg 150 years ago. A victory that sealed the deal on the Union's victory in the Civil War, sealed the deal on the simultaneous rise of the fortunes of U.S. Grant. And the outcome of that war started the long and arduous journey of civil rights for all Americans of every color in our Union. You might say the siege of Vicksburg started here a year earlier at Shiloh in southern Tennessee, north of Corinth, Mississippi. This is where the Union Army started trying to get a foothold that would lead to Vicksburg. And it went through the wet winter of 1862 into 1863 with all sorts of floating expeditions in the rivers and bayous of the Delta north of Vicksburg that winter. and maneuvers down the levees and on what little else dry land there was in Louisiana across the river. But for lack of any better concrete place in which to set a definite starting point for the siege of Vicksburg, let's put it here. Here at the Balfour House in Vicksburg, during the Christmas season of 1862. The libations were flowing, the music was playing, the people were dancing and dancing.
There was music and dancing and food and drink, and everybody was having a wonderful time until it was a horrible night, by the way, weather-wise. Cold, it was rainy, it was drizzly, it was awful, awful December. And late in the evening, a courier, all drenched and terrible, burst through the door hollering for General Smith. Well, M.L. Smith was the commander of the Confederate troops at the time. Well, he went to General Smith, and he breathlessly told him that Yankee gunboats were coming down the river. Anyway, General Smith announced that the ball was at an end. And he told the participants, of men, basically to report to their post, and for the women and the children to leave the city and so forth. And of course, they reported to their post, and the next day or two, they fought the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou north of town. And it was Sherman's first first commanding of troops independently. He had never had an independent command before, and he failed miserably. And he never made really an excuse for it. He simply said, I got beat. But he got beat because he was trying to bring his men through a swamp with water up to their chest, holding their rifles up to the bottom of a bluff where all the Confederates had to do was lean over and shoot. And naturally they lost. The Yankees lost. But he lost a lot of men. And that was the beginning, really, of trying to take, of the siege, so to speak. The siege wouldn't start until the next May. But this was the beginning of the troop movements.
Grant had Vicksburg's in his gun sights, as it were, since probably the middle of 1862, well before the siege, and tried any number of overland assaults and campaigns against the city, and that just wasn't working.
In reading Grant's own account of the Vicksburg Campaign, published in his memoirs that he finished just before his death, things like Sherman's defeat at Chickasaw Bayou and even the subsequent unsuccessful runs on Vicksburg through the waterways of the Delta didn't discourage Grant. For one thing, he says it showed him what wouldn't work, and for another, it gave him time to formulate a plan that would work. In the more varied attempts to reach Vicksburg in various ways from various places, he hoped would only serve to keep the Confederates guessing, and that would keep his actual plans in the dark just that much longer. One plan he had was to isolate Vicksburg by changing the course of the Mississippi River away from the front of the city. So during the winter of 1862-63, his men were busy digging this, Grant's Canal, that would reach across the southern end of the DeSoto Peninsula, a long tongue of land formed by a huge loop in the Mississippi River, with Vicksburg situated at the upper end. The idea was if enough of the river could be persuaded to run through the canal, then gunboats and troop transports could be gotten past the city, away from the guns trained on the river from Vicksburg. Now, that didn't work either. The canal washed out in the late winter floods, but that was okay with Grant, too. It kept his men busy through an otherwise idle time of the year, the wet winter, and put them into the physical shape they would need to be in for what would lie ahead when springtime came, and the weather warmed, and the roads, especially the roads south of Vicksburg on the Mississippi side of the river, up in the bluffs, dried sufficiently for troop movement. Bruinsburg becomes a big deal when we return. It's funny how places that played so heavily in history, significant places, can just vanish off the face of the earth. Such a place as Bruinsburg, Mississippi. It isn't actually accurate to say there's no sign of Bruinsburg left, because there actually is, well, a part of a sign, anyway. Decades ago, it was tacked to a tree to announce to travelers that they had arrived at the road to the village. But now, just as the earth has swallowed up the town, the tree has mostly swallowed up the sign, thrown over most of it, leaving just a couple of letters left to see. But Bruinsburg was the center of Union General U.S. Grant's universe as he began his springtime offensive against Vicksburg 150 years ago. But Bruinsburg was his second choice of a landing site.
I think he had really planned, from what I hear, and I'm not a military expert by any means, they really had thought they would come up the Big Black from Grand Gulf. And of course the South won at Grand Gulf. It was a battle with the cannons against the Navy.
A slave who told him that he knew a fine road into Port Gibson and literally led the people the 21st hour right to this house.
And I would like to think that black gentleman was my great-great-grandfather who showed him how to get the beachhead from the river, Bruinsburg, into Claiborne County.
The amazing thing, Bruinsburg is where several great things happened in history, in American history. This is pretty close to where Andrew Jackson married Rachel, right down the road. But Andrew Jackson, before he married Rachel, had a little store there. He sold slaves and whiskey and other things. Several years later, Aaron Burr came downriver. This is where he was arrested. He was not captured. He simply said, "I hear you're looking for me. I'm Aaron Burr." But that's where that happened. And then this is where Grant crossed the river, the largest amphibious landing in history. In 1863, he did that. And Bruinsburg doesn't exist anymore. You can't find it. There's nothing there.
Grant divided his troops at the T intersection, coming up out of Bruinsburg at the Rodney Road. Half went toward Port Gibson, half went right down a parallel road that rejoined the original road just before coming into the town. Each road has its historic significance, and each road has its souvenirs of the Civil War still standing. Down the left road, the Windsor ruins.
As a high school student here in Port Gibson, I used to take the back road going to Alcorn to their football and their basketball games. And when I would take that back road and come to a certain area of where Windsor started, the beginning of the plantation, I would have these feelings, these supernatural feelings that there's something about this area I'm supposed to know. I get a awakening that, hey, this is an area you're supposed to know about. And when eventually I did the research, that's when I discovered that my ancestors were slaves on this plantation. And as a matter of fact, one of my great uncles was named after the slave owner there, Smith Daniel Coffey. His name was Smith Daniel Wilson, and he lived in Chicago, died in Chicago, as a matter of fact. But I always had this feeling that this is an area I'm supposed to know about. And that's it. They were slaves on that plantation.
The The stately columns at Windsor may stand in the present, but they cast long shadows into the past. Smith Daniel Coffey, builder of Windsor, lived less than a year after moving in. And when the Union Army arrived, they were treated cordially. There were a lot of Union sympathizers in the South. The Army rested in the cornfields at Windsor before moving on to the Battle of Port Gibson the next day. As a matter of fact, the only surviving sketch of the house that was made while it was still standing was discovered in the diary of a Union soldier in the 1990s. Any other drawings, paintings, or photographs of Windsor made at the time were destroyed with the house when it burned in the 1890s, accidentally set on fire from a carelessly tossed lit cigar butt thrown into a pile of sawdust by a party guest. Now the columns only hint at what was probably the grandest house in the Old South, back in the era of such things. The rest of the troops took the road which is less traveled today, but we'll travel it when we come back. After a horrible winter of cold and rain and mud and muck along the Mississippi River in Louisiana and up in the Mississippi Delta, the last day of April of 1863, 150 years ago, General U.S. Grant's Union armies on high, dry ground on the Mississippi side of the river after having landed in Bruinsburg, led by a slave to the good roads to Port Gibson. Half the troops go down the road past Windsor, the other half take a parallel road that must look today much like it did when the Union Army marched down it. This is some of the most accessible, remote terrain in southwest Mississippi. Out in the middle of nowhere, there's a historic marker telling about the march to Port Gibson from Bruinsburg that passed this very way. It reads, after resting in a pleasant glen near Windsor the afternoon of the 30th of April, 1863, the Union troops resumed the march. General J.A. McClernand believed it important to surprise the Confederates near Port Gibson. as the column tramped down this road, many of the officers were afoot. Supplies were piled on all sorts of wagons and carriages. Discipline was lax. Passing Bethel Church, soldiers peppered away at the steeple. Guided by an old Negro, the column pushed through the darkness. By the way, that old steep-sided steeple at Bethel Church was lost to an early 20th century tornado. The remainder of the building still stands today between Windsor and Alcorn State University. At Bethel Church, the troops turned down a road that leads into the wilderness today. General Grant in his memoirs described the topography between Bruinsburg and Port Gibson like this. Grant says, "The country in this part of Mississippi stands on edge, as it were. The roads running along the ridges, except when they occasionally pass from one ridge to another. Where there are no clearings, the sides of the hills are covered with a very heavy growth of timber and undergrowth, and the ravines are filled with vines and canebrakes, almost impenetrable. This makes it easy for an inferior force to delay, if not defeat, a far superior one." Well, the fact of the matter is, Grant's army was at its most vulnerable while marching down the sunken roads out west of Port Gibson. And that same historic marker in the wilderness along this road also quotes a Union soldier's diary describing the march that night. And that soldier says, "As we pass along, an old darky gives us his blessings, but fears there will be few of us ever to return. The moon is shining above us. The road is romantic in the extreme. The artillery wagons rattle forward. The heavy tramp of many men gives a dull but impressive sound. In many places, the road seems to end abruptly. But when we come to the place, we find it turning at right angles, passing through narrow valleys, sometimes through hills, and presenting the best of opportunities to the rebels for defense if they had but known our purpose." But actually, the rebels had no idea of the Yankees' purpose in the bluffs the other side of Port Gibson because they didn't know they were there, because of a couple of diversionary tactics. Grant had sent Sherman up the Yazoo River to act like he was going to attack Snyder's Bluff. On the same day, his troops landed at Bruinsburg. That way, Confederate General Pemberton wouldn't get his troops too far out of Vicksburg and accidentally bump into him. And at the same time, Colonel Benjamin Grierson was riding through central Mississippi, tearing up railroads along the way, like this one in Newton, where he also burned the depot. So while some of Pemberton's scouting forces from Vicksburg were off trying to fight Grierson, and others were holding off Sherman at Snyder's Bluff, Grant slipped his entire army leisurely across the Mississippi River, unnoticed by the rebels. The first shots of the Vicksburg Campaign were fired from this spot in the front yard of the Schaefer House. Schaefer House is the lone structure still standing out here of the many buildings that were on this part of the Port Gibson battlefield at the time of the Civil War. Libby Schaefer Hollingsworth is a descendant of the Schaefer family, and says the night the Union soldiers came, there was just a house full of women here. The Schaefer men were off in Virginia fighting under Robert E. Lee's command.
The Iowans had the orders to march until fired upon. And they were fired upon right here because the Confederate pickets had been sent by General Greene up to our front gate because the line for the Confederates had been formed at Magnolia Church, which is about a quarter of a mile down the road.
Confederates got wind that the Union Army was coming down this road and set up an outpost where Magnolia Church once stood. Around midnight of April 30th, Confederate General Martin E. Greene rode forward to check on his pickets. At Schaefer House, he found the ladies frantically piling their household effects onto a wagon, and Greene assured the women that there's no need to hurry since the Yankees couldn't possibly arrive before daybreak. Famous last words, Greene had hardly gotten the words out of his mouth when there was a crash of musketry. The Southern pickets had exchanged shots with the Union vanguard. The women leaped into the wagon and headed for Port Gibson, while General Greene returned to Magnolia Church to alert his troops. the Confederate pickets fell back before the Federal advance, and the Vicksburg Campaign was underway. No longer was this road so romantic, I imagine. By now it was a place to either kill or be killed, as would be a lot of the Mississippi countryside for the next 2.5 months. Once General U.S. Grant crossed the Mississippi River with his troops from Louisiana and got onto the high, dry roads on the Mississippi side heading toward Port Gibson, he was well involved in his campaign to take Vicksburg. However, at the same time, Grant was under orders to assist General Banks in the taking of Port Hudson, farther south in Louisiana. Now, Banks was Grant's superior, so any credit for success in the taking of Port Hudson would have gone to Banks and not Grant. So after landing west of Port Gibson, Grant learned that Banks was still tied up on the Red River in Louisiana and not prepared to go on the offensive against Port Hudson. And Grant was delighted. He sent a letter to his superior, General Halleck at Washington, saying that he was going to pursue Vicksburg instead of Port Hudson, knowing it would take at least 8 days for that letter to get to Washington and then get a reply back. He could have half the campaign behind him by that time. So if Grant won Vicksburg, the credit would be his, and not his superior as it would be if he had to pull away and go after Port Hudson. Now, without going into a lot of detail, the first real battle between the Union and Confederacy in the Vicksburg Campaign was just to the west of Port Gibson. Many of the old buildings in the town were here when the Yankees marched through. City Hall, the Claiborne County Courthouse, most of the churches on Church Street. The buildings have roots that go way back before the Civil War. Now, for instance, St. Joseph Catholic Church's diocese is named for Rezin Bowie. Rezin Bowie is Jim Bowie of the Bowie knife fame's brother. Rezin supplied most of the funds to build the church so his wife would quit pestering their friends, including their Jewish friends, for contributions to build it. And the Presbyterian Church's iconic steeple with the hand pointing toward heaven was here. And the fact that these structures survived the war has led the town to adopt something General Grant is supposed to have said as their town slogan: "Too beautiful to burn." This may be the only southern town to have the Union General's quote as their town slogan. Of course, over the fog of time, many people now doubt Grant ever said such a thing. But Mayor Fred Reeves of Port Gibson points out the proof's in the pudding because the buildings are still here.
That's debatable, but I'd like to think that he did say that because look at Port Gibson now, it's beautiful. And I would assume it was beautiful then, and he probably said those words. Too beautiful to burn.
From Port Gibson, Grant's next big battle was at Raymond.
In order of progression, we went from Bruinsburg to Port Gibson, on up to Raymond several days later, on into Jackson. Then he turned his army west to Champion Hill, which was the bloodiest battle in the Vicksburg Campaign, to Big Black River, and then ultimately here to Vicksburg.
The Battle of Raymond, even though the South was greatly outnumbered, the South came very close to winning that one.
After the battle, the Raymond Courthouse and St. Mark's Episcopal Church were pressed into use as field hospitals. I'd say the marks on the tables in the courtroom upstairs at the courthouse are from Civil War amputations. And there are still dim bloodstains in the floorboards at St. Mark's Church. From Raymond, the next battle was Jackson, probably more notable for who wasn't here than who was.
And to get to Jackson, I think the significant thing about the Jackson battle was that Joe Johnston wasn't there.
Southern General Joe Johnston absented himself from the war at the defense of Jackson. Southern General Pemberton, defending Vicksburg, would find this same performance repeated over and over again by Johnston in the next few weeks. Just when Pemberton needed Johnston the most, he could be counted on not to be there.
And he was supposed to have been, defending Jackson and so on, and Joe Johnston pulled his usual stunt of not fighting.
In the city of Jackson today, Battlefield Park is about the most conspicuous leftover of the Civil War.
I would like to see some more interpretation around Jackson and a little more interest shown. The Battlefield Park was part of the 1863 siege of Jackson. There are earthworks there at Battlefield Park. They're very low trenches, but they're misidentified there as Confederate trenches. They're not. And there are a couple of artillery pieces located there. They're pointing in the wrong direction. And they're not Civil War guns either. They're from the Spanish-American War. Other than that, everything is completely correct at Battlefield Park.
There's still several homes standing from the period of the Civil War in Jackson. As well as many of Mississippi's iconic government buildings. The most decisive battle of the Vicksburg Campaign and the beginning of the siege of Vicksburg, when we come back. Abraham Lincoln had declared Vicksburg to be the key to winning the War of Southern Independence, or the War of Northern Aggression, or the war between the states, or the Civil War, as it has come to be known by all of these names over the 150 years since it was fought, and since it defined us as a nation, and ended some things, and put into motion many, many more things, some of which have yet to be resolved. So the Civil War isn't just history. It's still current events. Or as William Faulkner once said of the past, not only is it not dead, it isn't even past. But the battles and the warriors are history. One battle in particular that was most decisive in determining the outcome of the Vicksburg Campaign was fought over these hills and along Baker's Creek between Bolton and Edwards in Hinds County, the Battle of Champion Hill.
Champion Hill, which was the bloodiest battle in the Vicksburg Campaign.
I think Winston Churchill is the one that said Champion Hill is where the South lost the war, so to speak. Now, I'm not quoting it exactly, but Churchill's a pretty good historian, because Pemberton came very close to winning there, very close, and the tide turned, and of course we lost, and that was all she wrote, so to speak.
General Pemberton was out about halfway between Vicksburg and Jackson, heading south to cut Grant's supply line the other side of Raymond, when he got an order from Joe Johnston to attack Grant at Clinton. Doing it about face, the two armies met here. Here was the last good chance to defeat Grant. Had Johnston come in from Grant's backside, the Union Army would have been caught between the two Confederate armies. But Johnston was again a no-show. Late in the day of the Champion Hill battle, Pemberton retreated to the Big Black River to make one more stand there. In the Battle of Champion Hill, there were over 7,000 casualties, a little less than 3,000 for the North, and a little more than 4,000 for the South. In his memoirs, that night, after the battle, looking for a place to sleep, after Champion Hill, General Grant writes, "Finding ourselves alone, we stopped and took possession of a vacant house. No troops came up, so we moved back a mile or more until we met the head of the column just going into bivouac on the road. We had no tents, so we occupied the porch of a house which had been taken for a rebel hospital and which was filled with wounded and dying who had been brought from the battlefield we had just left. While the battle is raging, one can see his enemy mowed down by the 1,000 or by the 10,000 with great composure. But after the battle, these scenes are distressing, and one is naturally disposed to do as much to alleviate the suffering of an enemy as a friend." The Civil War was America's bloodiest conflict. Over 600,000 men died in that war, in combat, from disease, or in prison camps, roughly 2% of the population of the whole country at that time. It was so bad in the South that President Jefferson Davis lamented that we are grinding our seed corn, concerning the number of young Southerners lost to the war. The next day after Champion Hill at the Battle of the Big Black River, the South made a valiant but hopeless last stand. Completely routed by the North, fully half the defenders left behind at the Big Black River never made it back to Vicksburg. Many were taken captive or killed. A bunch of them drowned while trying to swim to safety across the Big Black. Well, this also turned out to be a moment of decision for General Grant. Back at the Battle of Port Gibson, Grant had sent a letter to his superior, General Halleck in Washington, telling him why he probably wouldn't wait around for General Banks to wrap up business on the Red River in Louisiana so he could assist Banks as an underling in the taking of Port Hudson on the Mississippi River near Baton Rouge, knowing it would take the dispatch many days to get to Washington and then get a reply back to Mississippi. Many days in which Grant could pursue his campaign against Vicksburg unopposed by his superiors. Well, as Grant was riding out on the field at the Battle of the Big Black River, the reply from Washington came to him in the form of a messenger. General Halleck ordered Grant to immediately go back to Grand Gulf and join up with Banks and go south and take Port Hudson. And Grant picks it up in his own words from his memoirs and told the officer that the order came too late and that Halleck would not give it now if he knew our position. The bearer of the dispatch insisted I ought to obey the order and was giving arguments to support his position when I heard great cheering to the right of our line, and looking in that direction saw Lawler in his shirt sleeves leading a charge upon the enemy. I immediately mounted my horse and rode in that direction, and saw no more of the officer who delivered the dispatch, I think, not even to this day. Well, Grant had just won his battle, the battle before him, and the political battle in the background. He didn't have to go anywhere under the shadow of a superior. Whatever happened at Vicksburg would be his, to his credit or to his blame, and probably to his credit as it was looking at this point. The next day, Grant tried to storm Vicksburg, and then tried once more after that. And the Confederate lines held, as all had predicted from Jefferson Davis on down, making them think Vicksburg could never be taken. And by battle, it couldn't. But on the other hand, by siege, or as Grant said it, by out-camping the enemy, sitting and waiting, lobbing shells into the town from the river and from the land side 24/7, and meanwhile not letting anyone or anything into or out of the city. Well, no one had counted on anything like that. The siege of Vicksburg when we come back.
Anyone else from the fall?
Tourists and other observers gather around the cannon and fortification display at the Information Center in the Vicksburg National Military Park, waiting the demonstration of the firing of the cannon. The tour guide tells the steps the cannoneers are going through in order to ready their instrument. It's a complicated dance, by the numbers, that ensures the cannon can be readied and fired efficiently, and in going by the numbers, ensure that no important steps are left out that may bring disaster to the crew if the charge went off too early. Other useful information is dispersed to the crowd, most of whom will take the tour of the park after this demonstration.
Okay, lesson 1, don't kick the anthills. They're fire ants. They will tear you up.
And nearing the close of the drill, the spectators are asked to step back to a safe distance, and the attention of the order of services shifts away from the tour guide to the captain of the artillery crew. As the moment nears, we who are watching are asked to cover our ears.
That's one cannon, folks. Imagine 172 along the Union lines, loading and firing day and night for 47 days.
It's a noise that you not only hear, but feel. And it was a common sound around Vicksburg for 47 days as the Union Army encircled the town, from Snyder's Bluff on the Yazoo River to the north to Warrenton south of town. A 14-mile long line that strangled the city with no food or ammunition or anything else allowed to pass into Vicksburg. April 30th, 1863, Union General Grant's army crossed the Mississippi River from Louisiana, landing at the extinct town of Bruinsburg, Mississippi, and taking a circuitous route through battles at Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and the Big Black River. And after 2 unsuccessful major assaults against the Confederate works at Vicksburg on May 19th and 22nd, Grant settled into an elongated siege against the blockaded city. No one or anything came in or out of Vicksburg.
Assaults were not going to work and siege was going to be necessary.
Didn't start with the siege, but after Grant attacked it several times, he settled down to a siege.
After the Confederate soldiers retreated from the Battle of the Big Black River into Vicksburg, the town became a city whose conditions were poor to start with and then deteriorated rapidly from that for 47 days.
Think about different phases of it. First of all, you've got maybe 17,000 Confederate soldiers in the city, in a city of 5,000 people. Back in that day, there was no such thing as sewage and plumbing. Can you imagine the stench? Food got scarcer and scarcer.
To escape the constant shelling from the Union lines on the land side and the Union fleet on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg went underground, with its population digging caves in the hillsides and living in them until the end of the siege. Although General Pemberton, a Northerner by birth, feared public condemnation if he surrendered the city, he had no choice but to hand over Vicksburg to the Union Army. And he chose a conspicuous day on which to do so, Independence Day, the 4th of July.
Well, of course, that's the birth date of our nation, and General Pemberton thought that if he could hold out until then, perhaps he could take advantage of any patriotism that General Grant may have and get more favorable surrender conditions.
The irony of it was that Vicksburg, at the beginning of the war, was a Union town, very pro-Union. And I tell people, we were pro-Union until they shot at us. That will change your mind a lot of times, and it did.
The loss of Vicksburg, coupled with the loss of Port Hudson 5 days later, and the horrific loss by the Confederates at Gettysburg, all in the same period of time, took away any hopes of the South of ever winning the war, although the war went on for 2 more years.
It was just a strange coincidence of history that Vicksburg and Gettysburg came to a conclusion at exactly the same time, and as Ed Barrs and Parker Hills said in their book, Receding Tide, I mean, they tied those 2 battles together and basically framed it as the high point of the Confederacy, if you will, and then, of course, the war lasted 2 full years after that. But
the battlefield surrounding Vicksburg, as well as the area in Delta, Louisiana at Grants Canal, are all under the authority of the Vicksburg National Military Park. The park was established on February 21st of 1899. In the park are monuments and memorials from the states participating in the siege of Vicksburg. Monuments to some of the principals in the battle, North and South. And other important monuments, such as the memorial in memory of the U.S. colored troops, who first came under fire in the Civil War while guarding Grant's supply depot at Milligan's Bend, Louisiana, during the siege of Vicksburg. Heard a story about a youngster one time asking his dad if he ever noticed how many Civil War battles were fought in national parks. Of course, the national parks were formed to preserve the battlefields, but that war was fought 150 years ago. Are these parks still important to keep today?
I think that goes back, really who we have to thank for that are the soldiers who served during the Civil War. It was their efforts in the years after the war that resulted in Vicksburg and Shiloh, Chattanooga, Chickamauga, and others being preserved. It was recognized even then, I think, that this was just a seminal chapter in American history, and that we didn't want to forget what had happened. We certainly didn't want to repeat it again, and this was a real good way to help ensure against that, is to preserve the land so that future generations could learn.
There are 17,000 Union soldiers buried in the National Cemetery at Vicksburg, more than any other cemetery in the nation. Fully 13,000 of them are unknown. Over 7,000 of them are black Union troops. Mayor Fred Reeves of Port Gibson's great-great-grandfather served in the Union Army after he ran away from the plantation where he was a slave after Grant's army came through 150 years ago.
And that is where my great-great-grandfather died. He died in Milligan's Bend, and he's buried in the Vicksburg National Cemetery.
Confederate dead from the siege are buried in the Soldiers' Rest section of Vicksburg's Cedar Hill Cemetery. About 5,000 soldiers are buried here. All of these dead, and so many more across half the country, made history, of course. And with the surrender of the South at the end of the war, several things happened that still affect us today. First of all, we undisputedly became the United States, indivisible. And then with the Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent passage of the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished in the United States. The home of the brave became the land of the really free.
My grandmother, my great-granddaddy, I'm sure they'd be turning over in their graves right now because they never had given it a thought that their grandson could be the mayor of Port Gibson.
And the beginning of the end of the Civil War is preserved right here in Vicksburg. Hey, I want to extend a word of thanks to General Grant for his lenient terms of surrender here at Vicksburg in paroling all of the Confederates. Because I had a great-great-grandfather, my daddy's mother's father, Hiram Welch from Rankin County, Mississippi, was serving here in Vicksburg, and was among those Confederates who were paroled. Had he been taken prisoner of war and ferried up the river and taken to a northern prisoner of war camp, odds were greater he would have died there than on the battlefield at Vicksburg. And had he died a POW, well, you'd have had a different host for this program. So thank you, General Grant. Appreciate that. And Vicksburg itself is no longer known as the Key City, as it was in war days. Now it's the Red Carpet City. And its red carpet is rolled out no wider for a broader spectrum of the people of Mississippi than in July of every year, when Vicksburg is again invaded, but this time by contestants and fans of the Miss Mississippi pageant. maybe in a way, something like this pageant is one of the most lasting monuments of the Civil War. Our Civil War was fought and won by a nation that's turned its battlefields into national parks and converted its siege sites into places for pageants.